I'm a junior sustainability consultant here at Turner and Townsend. We're joined today by Gabrielle Marinouk, who is an associate director in contract services within Turner and Townsend. This is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner and Townsend. I will now hand over to Gabriella to start today's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mia. Hi, everyone. Really lovely to be here and talk to you about my favorite subject, which is sustainable procurement. As Mia mentioned, I'm an associate director within contract services in Turner and Townsend, and I'm focused on the sustainable procurement capability. Today, we'll explore how integrating sustainability into our procurement processes not only meets regulatory and stakeholder expectations, it also drives significant environmental and social benefits. As you can see in the content, we're going to cover everything from fundamentals of ESG, GSG. We're going to go into practical tools, strategy, procurement strategy, and how that aligns with the sustainability enterprise-wide, and how we can work with our suppliers to enhance their capabilities in order to build our resilient and future-proof supply chain. By the end of this session, you shall be able to understand what are the commercial advantages of sustainable procurement and be equipped with actionable insights to implement these practices within your organizations. So with that said, let's dive in and discover how we can make procurement the most powerful tool that we can in order to operationalize the sustainability. First, let's have an overview of what sustainable procurement is. It's often a very misunderstood topic. What do you think when you hear sustainable procurement? What comes to your mind? Is it recycling or using eco-friendly materials? I would say that it's actually a much broader topic than that. So firstly, I would think about boosting decarbonization. So for us, this isn't just a buzzword. It's about making real changes in how we manufacture the goods, how we manage logistics, how we produce energy. So imagine if every product we use had a smaller carbon footprint, thanks to all these efforts. It's also about cleaner air and a healthier planet for everyone. Also, it works on preventing the exploitation of natural resources. So it's about striking a balance, so we don't run out of every material that keep our industries running, like copper and other rare materials and minerals that we need. Another crucial aspect is the ensuring supplier practices observe and adhere to human rights and labor standards. I think we all know that this is a huge issue in specific industries that can have a significant reputational backlash for companies across the value chain. Sustainable procurement means we're holding our suppliers to high ethical standards by including this into contracts from very early stage, like the tender process. Also, let's not forget about the encouraging equality, diversity, inclusion across our supply chains. This isn't just a corporate checkbox. It's about creating opportunities for everyone, ensuring diverse voices are heard, fostering an environment where everyone can thrive, and finally, boosting jobs availability, skill creation. Like this workshop, for example, it's for your professional development. So sustainable procurement isn't just about protecting the environment. It's an all-encompassing subject that puts people at the center of it, and it's about a future where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. So if we look a little bit, talking about the news and the backlash that poor sustainable procurement implementation has, these are just a handful of stories from the more recent news, but I guess everyone remembers potentially other news stories for the past 4 or 5 weeks, not to mention anyone in particular, or if you're old enough, you would remember the ones from the 90s, a huge scandal with Nike. So these all stories underline how broad and impactful sustainable procurement is. And it's important that We're looking at the supply chain resiliency, ethical sourcing, volatile regions, and then hold to account our suppliers on ethical and responsible sourcing and practices. Moving forward, I think next is important to understand what ESG is, because ESG, it's at the base of our sustainable procurement practices. Probably you've already heard about this term quite a lot. Probably most of you would already know what it stands for, where it's originally coming from, but I will give you the basic information anyway, just in case. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it's a key framework for sustainability in general, enterprise-wide. Originally, ESG came from socially responsible investing. Today, it's just the basis, at the cornerstone of all sustainable practices. So if we deep dive into each of the words, of the letters, so we're looking at E, environmental. It focuses on how the company's operations impact the natural world. Think about reducing emissions, managing waste, and conserving resources. Social, this aspect deals with a company's relationship with people, employees, customers, suppliers, the broader community where they're operating in. And it's about creating a positive social impact. And lastly, governance. It's all about how companies run. It includes the practices, controls, procedures that driving all these decisions and make sure that they're ethical, transparent, and within compliance with the law, with the local law. So in essence, ESG is all about making sure that our business operations are sustainable, they're ethical, responsible, and it's a holistic approach to ensure a long-term success and positive impact. Specifically, if we're looking at the ESG in housing and retrofit industries, let's see how that applies. So starting with environmental impact, we look at three key areas. Energy efficiency. This means using less energy to perform the same tasks in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, using sustainable materials in constructions, and so choosing materials that are eco-friendly and have a lower environmental footprint, and waste management, so effectively managing waste to minimize the impact on the environment. Moving on to the social impact, we're looking at health and well-being, ensuring that the housing conditions promote physical and mental health, community engagement, in order to involve the community in decision-making processes when we're looking at different developments, and creating affordable housing, and to make sure that the housing is accessible to people from all economic backgrounds. And lastly, in governance, this industry in retrofit and housing, focusing on transparency, so clear and open communication about practices and policies, ethical procurement, looking into sourcing materials and labor in a manner that is fair and just, and compliance, adhering to laws, regulation, standards to ensure responsible operations. So in summary, by integrating ESG principles, the housing and retrofit sectors can create not just sustainable, but also socially responsible and well-governed environments. This holistic approach will ensure long-term benefits for both the community as well as the environment. Next, we're deep diving into understanding the carbon or the greenhouse gases. So this is one of the crucial aspects of sustainable procurement, and mostly because we are in the right position of decarbonizing and influencing the decarbonization of the supply chains, where most of the carbon impact comes from. So in order to decarbonize, we need to understand what carbon is. So first it's important to know that all greenhouse gases have different lifespans and global warming potentials. This means that they stay in the atmosphere for varying lengths of time and have different abilities to trap heat. To make sense of these differences, we use a common unit of measure, which is called the CO2e, which stands for carbon dioxide equivalent. And this metric helps us to compare the impact of different greenhouse gases on a common scale. For instance, the most common gases are the carbon dioxide, which can last over 1,000 years in the atmosphere and is using the global potential warming of 1, which is basically the baseline of measuring. Then we have the methane, which has the lifespan of 12 years in average, but it has a much higher impact when it comes to global warming potential, which is 28 or 84 times higher than CO2. And then lastly, we have nitrous oxide, which lasts around 120 years and has a global warming potential of 264. These are only 3 of the most common greenhouse gases. However, there are many others, each with its own characteristics and lifespan. But these examples highlight the importance of understanding their varying impacts. So continuing from the previous slide on the different types of gases and their impacts, this graph is showing a deeper dive into the physical drivers of climate change. So this chart breaks down the contribution of various greenhouse gases and other factors of global warming. So as we discussed, the CO2 is a primary driver of climate change, mainly because of its long lifespan and significant presence in the atmosphere. And methane, despite its shorter lifespan, is high global warming potential. It's one of the major contributors as well. And the other gases also play a substantial role within their potential warming effects. Additionally, I think on this graph we can see contributions from aerosols like sulfur dioxide, organic carbons. These are carbon compounds that come from living organisms like forests or crops when they're burned or decomposed. So they release organic carbon. And then black carbon, which is essentially soot. So these are fine particles formed when you're burning wood or fossil fuels, for example, diesel engines when they're burning, when they're running, or fire stoves. Hence the recent legislation with regards to the fire stoves usage in houses. Well, some of the aerosols can have the cooling effect. Some of them do contribute to the warming issues. Other factors that we should be looking at is the land use changes. So activities such as deforestation and urbanization, they do affect the carbon sequestration and release. Aviation also contribute to warming by impacting the cloud formation and trapping the heat. So I guess in general, this visual representation helps us understand the multifaceted nature of the climate change and different drivers that we need to take in consideration depending on the industry that we're working on and the projects that we're looking into. So it's a very complex topic that has many factors contributing to that we need to consider at each step. And also, and this is where it starts getting into the more operationalized side of greenhouse gas emission and the link into sustainable procurement. And to better build our understanding of greenhouse gases, they are basically categorized within these 3 buckets: scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1, these are direct emissions. These are our own controlled sources, for example, from company office buildings and vehicles. So it's essentially the emissions we have most control over. Then scope 2, these are the indirect emissions from purchased energy. Also, again, this is fairly straightforward to map and fairly straightforward to control. So if we want to reduce the carbon footprint on scope 2, we always have the option of negotiating a contract with our energy providers to give us a higher allocated renewable energy or just buy completely renewable energy. Scope 3, this is often the largest and most complex category. This is where between 75 and 80% of total emissions are coming from. And it's the most complex one because it's looking at the entire value chain, upstream and downstream as well. And most of the times we only have visibility and control over the first tier of our suppliers or the first tier downwards, like our clients. So this is why the scope 3 one is the most challenging category to when addressing decarbonization. But it's also the most important one because this is where the grand majority of our carbon emissions are sitting. And next, within the ESG spectrum, we're looking at the sustainability and the social value. Social value is another category that procurement in itself has a huge say. So just if we have a look at like overall history of it and the evolution over the decades, starting in the 80s, we saw the rise of offshoring. So companies began moving their production overseas to cut costs. Back in the 80s, procurement was all about cost, the cheaper the better. So offshoring was often impacting the environment and social of the local production, but also think about all the factories that were relocated. So there's a lot of jobs that were eliminated within the previous market. Then in the 90s, the focus shifted to concerns of the sweatshops and human rights. But as I mentioned before, some of you might remember the Nike sweatshop scandal at the end of the 90s and the poor working conditions in these offshore factories. And unfortunately, these are still news that we hear of in these days about the poor working conditions and the significant reputational damage for many brands. It's unfair to just call out Nike from the 90s. I think we had Under Armour last year having exactly the same issue. So, but in the 90s, the era was also the introduction of corporate social responsibility as response of those sweatshop scandals and companies starting to realize the importance of their social impact. Moving on into the 2000s, the ESG monitoring was born, which marked a significant shift. So environmental concerns become more and more prominent, and we started to see the greater emphasis on social value. For instance, the UK Climate Change Act of 2008 set ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions. In the 2010s, brought more focused approach on the built environment with standards like BES and APRES. There was an increasing focus on carbon emissions, human rights. They all remained critical considerations. The Sustainable Development Goals set in 2015 provided a global framework for achieving sustainability. And finally, if we look at the 2020s, we're seeing more robust supply chain legislation and a significant ramp up in social value initiatives. Investors and supply chains increasingly required to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability. There's a vast legislation currently, not only in UK, but within the European Union. I think in February, we saw new legislation that is specifically impacting the decarbonization of supply chains for all companies that have any type of operation within the European Union. Another notable milestone included the Modern Slavery Act and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I think from April last year, companies over 500 employees and above, they had to submit to their financial disclosure on climate-related financial disclosures, and this is only applicable for scope 1 and 2. But we know that there is a legislation coming up with regards to scope 3, so the supply chain decarbonization, even if it's only upstream and even if it's only a plan and an initiative right now to be implemented from 2030 onwards, it still has to be declared and it has to be moved forward. Now, let's deep dive a little bit into sustainable procurement drivers and how it influences different stakeholders, regulators, investors, and also we see a huge push from consumer side as well. So starting with regulation, so we have two ends of the spectrum at the moment. We have the reactive spectrum, where companies' approach is about avoiding penalties, essentially. So companies comply with regulation just enough to avoid fines and legal issues, minimum investment. And then we have organization at the other end of the spectrum where they're being proactive, they're focusing on maximizing their sustainability investments. They actively seek out ways to exceed regulatory investments and requirements. They view sustainability as a strategic advantage. And actually, if we're looking at S&P 500, we see a huge trend upwards in share price for companies that do have actionable roadmap for implementing decarbonization and sustainable measures rather than the ones that are at the reactive end of the spectrum. Moving on into investors, their perspective also can vary. So there is the appeasement end of the spectrum, which is about maintaining the status quo through minimal engagement. These are companies that do the bare minimum to keep investors content without making any significant changes or financial investments. And then we have other companies that are at the end of the spectrum on growth, which are proactive. These companies increase investor value directly through sustainability, as I've mentioned before, through the S&P data. They understand the sustainable practices and they understand how they drive long-term growth and investor confidence. Because essentially, having a sustainable, decarbonized supply chain is having managed risk supply chain. And finally, let's consider the consumers. So we have the transactional end of the spectrum. So this approach focuses on mainly meeting immediate consumer needs. So it's all looking at the cost, the time to deliver, the quality, and it's about reacting to demands without actually having like a broader long-term vision. And then we have the end spectrum, which is the future-proof one, which is literally embedding sustainability within the customer hierarchy of needs. So it's not just about costs, it's about having a sustainable product and anticipating future demands for potential products and services. And as we've seen from the data so far, this kind of approach is ensuring consumer loyalty and relevance on the market. So I think it's really important to understand these drivers because it helps us to see the full picture of sustainable procurement. So it makes us see where we are on this journey within the maturity, so to speak, of the companies when it comes to sustainable procurement. At the moment, because we are quite at the beginning of the journey, the grand majority of the companies are more closer to the reactive regulation and appeasement for investments and transactional for consumers. However, we do have some trailblazing companies that we're working with that are looking into not only meeting the regulation, but also going above and beyond that. So we're seeing more compelling insights in the recent years from reputable organizations and researchers as well. So as I've mentioned, S&P Global published the data about S&P 500 share prices. We have the research from Bloomberg from 2021 and also Imperial College London research from last year. So they all show that sustainable procurement is not just about meeting current demands, it's about preparing for future, basically unlocking opportunities to navigate the increasingly complex supply chain and also regulatory landscape. And talking about supply chain and how it looks like. So this diagram, for example, illustrates like a typical supply chain for a cement supplier. And as you can see, the environmental, social, and economical impacts are multiplied as you travel down through the tiers. At the top, we have the buying organization, which directly interacts with the tier one, with the prime supplier, in this case, the cement supplier. So this relationship, obviously, it's the fundamental one because the buying organization sets the tone for sustainability expectations and practices. And this is the one that it's easier to set up because you can either work with your existing supplier on implementing, I don't know, an apprenticeship scheme to make sure that you're employing locally or that you implement lower carbon products within that you're buying from them, but you don't have any control over what's happening beyond tier one. So moving down to tier two, these are the suppliers of the aggregates. So you have sand, water, packaging. Each of these suppliers contribute to the overall sustainability and footprint of the final product that we're buying as organization. So if we look at aggregates and sand suppliers, these affect the land use and the resource extractions. The water suppliers, obviously, they have an impact on the local water resources and quality. The packaging suppliers, they need to consider like materials and waste management. Designing the packaging is, I think, one of the most straightforward ways of decarbonizing the end product. Looking at the energy suppliers, they're pivotal in determining the carbon footprint by their energy sources. So, as mentioned before, they could use renewable energy, but this is not always an option within the manufacturing process. And then finally, looking at the third tier, I think here we have a more diverse area of suppliers. So we have, in this case, for example, we have limestone, energy, chalk, chemicals, etc. So each of the suppliers adding another layer of complexity and impact on the final product. So if we're talking about mining, for example, in the limestone supplier example, this is leading to land degradation. And I think we're having a lot of examples on negative impact on the surrounding environment, the mining companies. The chemical suppliers, they have to manage the hazardous materials and so on. So understanding this layered structure, it emphasizes why it's so critical to embed sustainability across all the tiers of the supply chain. But in order to do this at every single step, we need to have a very collaborative approach with our tier one suppliers and across the whole of the value chain. So I think most of you within this group have heard about SIPs and their accreditation within procurement community, and they have added the sustainable procurement module to their accreditation as well. And this is a recognition of how important it is to have and to recognize sustainable procurement in its own right as a function. So I think the key here is that sustainable procurement doesn't require teams to reinvent themselves or significantly ramp up headcount. It's more of a building on existing procurement activities with a renewed focus on specific areas. So the focus is moving from transactional procurement into a more strategic function. And the focus is to embed, apart from procurement professional, to embed within the procurement function sustainability professionals as well. And I think by gaining this visibility over the value chain and integrating sustainable practices, procurement activities become the key to align operations with the broader enterprise-wide sustainability goals. And this holistic approach ensures that every tier of your supply chain contributes to reducing the overall carbon footprint and improving the social outcomes. And sustainable procurement isn't just about doing the right thing about environment and society. It also brings substantial business advantages. And by prioritizing sustainability, we align not only with the regulation and the investors, we also align with the customer pressures and expectations, as well as employees. As we know very well that many people, even in the last couple of years, refusing to join companies that historically don't have ethical practices. So I think this alignment enhances the trust and loyalty of the customers as well as employees, which are, of course, business drivers in themselves. So supply chain emissions management is another critical benefit. So reducing the emissions throughout the supply chain helps us meet regulatory requirements and reduce the costs associated with energy use and waste management. And I think we saw last week in the news that within the UK, we managed to use renewable energy in the majority of household consumptions for the first time, which I think it was a really great news. And we know that we do have more and more offshore wind stations being built around the UK. Addressing modern slavery and human rights issues, it's also ensuring the fair labor practices throughout the supply chain, not only within the UK, but from wherever we're looking into procuring our goods and services from. And talking about strategies and alignment, crafting a sustainable procurement strategy is basically aligning the organization or enterprise-wide sustainability ambition and supporting the ESG goals. So first up, we need to draft up the strategy and the governance, which is making sure that the procurement approach aligns with our enterprise-wide sustainability objectives and is integrating. The integration is the key to ensuring every decision supports our organization's missions and ambition. The enablers, the tools and data we need to make the sustainable procurement decisions. So this includes analytics, supplier information, and data monitoring systems that help us track and manage these efforts year on year. Then procurement cost execution and contract management. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to say. It's all about putting the strategies into action, working with suppliers, managing contracts, making sure sustainability criteria are consistently met. And so this is where we operationalize the sustainable procurement strategy. And then finally, we have the benefits realization. So this is a strong sustainable procurement strategy where it delivers the real tangible benefits. So this means that financial gains, better environmental outcomes, improved social impacts, they're all measured and they're aligned to contributing to the ESG goals. And deep diving into the operational bit, so the procurement execution and the supplier capability building. So we wouldn't be able to achieve anything if the supply chain is not aligned with our sustainability vision and is not willing to work on improving themselves in order to improve our end product. So in essence, we're as good as our suppliers. So working with them, collaborating with them, and building their capability is essentially a key part of our procurement execution. So this involves considering every stage of the supply chain and integrating sustainable practices throughout. So we start with the design phase, where we focus the energy on the lifetime of the usage of the product and specifying sustainable material. So integrating ways of extracting, for example, copper elements from automotive part is one way of to make sure that they're easily recyclable and to be used to something else. It's one way of considering sustainable procurement or sustainable elements within the design phase. Also, an important element in the design phase is considering the whole circular economy of parts. Then we have the non-renewable material use. So we need to look at materials like steel, cement, plastic, and how can we reduce the use? Can we find alternatives? Cement is a huge element of improvement, and I know that there have been, over the last couple of years, some alternative materials that were found. They're much more carbon friendly. Production methods. So this is another crucial area. So this includes reducing GHG emissions, supporting local employment, and minimizing pollution. The use of the water within the production element is really, really important. Logistics, obviously, we need to think about the transport, what kind of trucks we're using, what kind of means of transportation are we using, what storage are we using, etc. So if we can minimize the carbon footprint, where are we manufacturing the goods, where do they need to consolidate, in which warehouse, how is that building, the warehouse itself, built and managed. These are all essential impacts of our overall supply chain. Service delivery. So this includes cloud storage and the movement of people and products, and how can we make this process a bit more sustainable. Use and maintenance. We need to consider the employment and development, social value, energy use during the life cycle of our products. And finally, reuse and recycle options. So for this, we should explore ways to manage consumer waste, use construction materials more efficiently, as mentioned at the beginning, in the design phase, embrace the circular economy. So all it comes up to to a whole. Talking about sustainable procurement enabling tools, I've mentioned a couple of slides ago. So these are crucial on one hand because we live in a world where everything is about technology, and without these tools we would have to do everything manually, which would not get us to very far. So for one, these tools help us meet the expectation of our stakeholders, whatever there's investors, customers, or employees. Digital first approach within sustainable procurement, as well as in all other areas of the businesses, are expected rather than nice to have. Secondly, these tools give us a clear picture of our company's carbon footprint and social impact. It helps us track everything holistically. It's not just about knowing the direct emissions, like scope 1, but understanding the full ESG scope, like what is the impact that we're having on our local community, for example, and how does it track against our metrics. So what kind of tools are we actually talking about? So we have grouped them into 3 different buckets. So on one, we have the carbon emissions calculators. These are designed to help us track and manage the full spectrum of carbon emissions in order to identify the hotspots and help us draft roadmaps and a clear plan for decarbonization. These tools simplify the task of consolidating data, estimating emissions for all categories, and we're of course using the GHG protocol in order to have a common baseline as all the other companies do. And with these carbon emission calculators, we can have a more comprehensive overview of the company's carbon footprint. Secondly, supply chain mapping tools. So with this, companies can gain visibility throughout their entire value chain. So starting from tier 1 up until the raw material level. So with this, companies can measure emissions, intensity of supplier facilities, for example, wherever their goods are being manufactured in, track raw materials to their source, identify high emissions area for carbon reduction initiatives. And then lastly, we have the balanced scorecards for tracking wider ESG metrics. And these are crucial in helping us integrate ESG criteria into procurement contracts, set clear sustainability requirements for our suppliers within the tender process, help us promote accountability, drive suppliers to develop themselves and to adopt more sustainable practices, and overall reduce not only the scope 3 emissions, but also integrating the social and governance criteria into our business as usual as well. So I think the huge difference between the approach of the lower maturity companies and the higher maturity company is adoption of these tools and using them within day-to-day operations and tracking them year on year in order to, on one hand, report to the stakeholders, and on the other hand, to make sure that all their initiatives actually paying off. Thank you. So that was the last one that we had. So conscious of the time, I think I whizzed through the last couple of slides, but please do let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.